And it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Ricardo and Fernando. And thank you all for taking the time to come and see me. It's wonderful to be in Bogota. I've been to Colombia a couple of times, but this is the first time in Bogota, and it's beautiful. So I know the mayor was here, and I want to thank him and others for all the hospitality, making the arrangements so that I can visit this beautiful city.
So welcome, Mr. President. And thank you very much for being here today at EXMA. Once again, you're making history. Today, you're making history for the marketing community, for this audience filled with entrepreneurs and innovators, business leaders and visionaries, students and makers, who are all eager to hear and learn from you. You're one of the most remarkable leaders of the 21st century, and to have the opportunity to hear you speak about your experience and insights about leadership, innovation, creativity and education firsthand is simply priceless. We are all aware that we are not in an era of change, but a change of era. And talking about change, you once said, change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. So let's start with the first question, Mr. President. As you know, our focus is on entrepreneurship, innovation, and marketing. Our goal then is for you to share your experience and advice with this audience to inspire and share some of your wisdom. So first, how do you deal with change, and what's your message for this audience today to embrace and become change?
Well, we're living in a time, and this is true whether you live in Colombia, or you live in Argentina, or you live in Kenya, or you live in China. We're living in a time of rapid change. In fact, change is happening today faster than any time in human history. If you think about the transition from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution, that took 100 to 150 years. Maybe the transition from the industrial age to the information age might have taken an entire generation. Now, every 5 years, every 10 years, because of the power of computers, because of breakthroughs in genetic medicine, because of the information explosion. Everybody has their phones out, right? So now in your pocket you have more information than the greatest libraries in the world used to have. Because of that, whether you are a business, a government, a nonprofit, or an individual, how well you succeed will depend on how well you can adapt to these rapid changes. And I think that for me as president, I had a vantage point to see both the good and the bad that came about from these changes. On the good side, you see a global supply chain that is generating more wealth around the world than ever before. The bad side of it is that it's creating more inequality than ever before, and that creates great tensions in terms of social solidarity and puts strains on our democracy. The same power that we have on the internet that allows a child in a remote village potentially to listen to the top lectures of the top universities is also the same power that allows terrorists to organize and attack innocent people. So, how we adapt to this change as a society is, I think, going to be the test for all of us. For me, there have been a couple of basic principles that I constantly think about when I see change. This was true when I was president, it's true now that I'm the ex-president. Number one, I think, is recognizing that in a world that's changing rapidly, it's important for us to understand that diversity is a strength, and that people who have different backgrounds, different ideas, different beliefs, come from different races, different nations, that is a strength and a power. That's not a weakness, but we have to embrace our differences and learn to understand each other better, because the world is shrinking very quickly. Number two, I think we have to recognize that some of the old structures and hierarchies don't work anymore because power is now decentralized. And so the effective organization, whether it's a government or a business, it has to empower all the people who are part of that team, not just have one person at the top who has all the information and is sending it down to tell people what to do. Number three, I think that it's very important that during this period of rapid change, we understand that knowledge is power, and that means investing in our human capacity and resources is the single most important thing that we can do. As a nation, the most important thing Colombia can do is to teach its children. The same is true in the United States. The power of a country like Singapore doesn't come from its natural resources. It has to do with the fact that they have 100% literacy, and they produce outstanding math and science and engineering students, and as a consequence, they can leverage that knowledge in a way that allows them to have an extraordinarily high standard of living relative to some countries that may have enormous natural resources but are not investing in their people. I think at a time right now in the world in which there's a contest of ideas between people who want to look backwards and are clinging to the old ways of doing things. So they think in terms of hierarchy and patriarchy and tribalism and ethnic divisions and religious absolutism. They define themselves as us and somebody else as them, and it's a very traditional way of thinking about power and how to build an economy. That, I think, is on the losing side. But right now, you're seeing, because of all the uncertainty, some of those attitudes have been on the rise. I think over the long term, the countries that succeed are going to be the ones that embrace the future and change rather than look to the past. And that means empowering all people, giving every child an opportunity, giving them all the talent, or tapping into all the talents that people have, regardless of whether they're men or women, whether they're black or white, whether they start off poor or they come from a wealthy family. Do they have the opportunities, and are we giving them the knowledge base so that they can innovate and succeed in this new world?
Fantastic, Mr. President. You want to clap your hands, please? Let me stay 1 second with knowledge, because one of the main challenges for the future is regarding education. During your presidency, you raised education as a key aspect of your mandate. You mentioned that education can only evolve if every party is involved: government, academia, families, and private sector. Our admirer Nelson Mandela used to say that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Which are the biggest challenges for this new world in terms of teaching and learning?
Well, as President of the United States, one of the challenges that I saw, and I think this is true in many countries, is that some young people get an excellent education and others are left behind. And if there's one thing we know, and I mentioned this in my earlier remarks, it is that the countries that succeed today are the ones where everybody is educated and everybody has opportunity, and that means that we have to invest in our public infrastructure and our public school systems. In the United States, there are cities where the private school system, where the wealthy can send their children, do an excellent job, but the public schools do not do as good of a job. And what that means is that half of your talent is not being cultivated. Half of your talent is not being trained. And if you you were running a business, you would never say, we're just going to train half of our people. And the other half, if they don't know what they're doing, so what? Well, as a country, we have to think the same way. Everybody has to have some baseline of knowledge in order for them to succeed. Now, I think part of what's happening in education is that we do have to rethink our education systems. In the United States, for example, our education system is still designed to move children from farms into factories. And that's why we have a certain schedule for our schools, and we teach people by rote learning very rigidly how to memorize things oftentimes, when in fact, what we now need to teach our young people is how to be creative, how to work in teams, how to critically analyze information. And so we have to do a better job of redesigning our schools, I think, across both developed and developing countries. One of the most important things we can do in education is to elevate teachers. Pay teachers more, respect teachers more. In the United States, historically, teaching is not a high-paid profession, in part because it used to be that was one of the few places where women had an opportunity to succeed professionally. And because of sexism and bias, then you paid women less, and so the teaching profession got paid less. But if you look at, for example, countries like Finland, which has one of the best education systems in the world, it's as hard to become a teacher as it is a doctor. And you have to train just as long, and you get paid just as much as being a doctor or a lawyer. And so part of the goal, I think, for education is to invest in our teaching corps and recognize that that's one of the most important professions we can have. The other thing that we are starting to look at, I think, is information technology as a tool to teach. You're starting to see even some of the best universities in the United States, like Stanford and Harvard, are starting to put courses online and partner with highly effective online learning systems where people can get degrees remotely rather than being on college campuses that can reduce costs. And the final trend that I'm seeing in education that I think is important is not all education has to be 4 years of a college education. Because in the United States, for example, we have a shortage of skilled tradesmen, plumbers, electricians. Training people for practical work is also important. As long as we continue to give them opportunities as they master their trade, then to take the next step, potentially, if they decide they want to start their own business, they can also get a business degree. Or if they want to be a manager in a larger company, they can rise up. And so all of us, I think, have to recognize the process of lifelong learning. You know, Michelle and I, we talk all the time about the fact that, you know, she's not old, I'm getting old. So, she always reminds me. But our goal is never to stop learning. And for young people now to have a successful career in any nation, they have to continually update their skills. It's a continuous lifelong learning that takes place. And I think young people recognize this because they understand that if the days are gone when you go to work in one company and you work in that company for 30 years because the economy is too dynamic. If your skills become obsolete, you're going to be out of luck. Yeah.
Absolutely. You mentioned your wife, Michelle. She's a powerful figure and role model for a lot of people. Michelle is widely seen as a partner and a mother and a true trailblazer. And you also said once that she's your best friend. It's very nice. Which lessons about leadership have you learned from her?
Well, it's an interesting question. Michelle is unique. I mean, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, she's... she's funny. She's honest. She's a great professional, but she's also a wonderful mother for her daughters. I think actually the thing that I've learned from her is something that I understood because I was raised mostly by my mother and my grandmother, Abuela. And that is, so it's something I knew, but each day as I watch her, and now I have my daughters, I understand more and more. And that is that if you, in your organization, in your life, in your families, are not showing absolutely equal respect to women, then your organization over time is going to fail. That's true of your house, that's true of your business. And this is not just, my opinion. They've actually not done studies. Organizations that have enough women on their board of directors perform better. This is for-profit businesses and companies. They are higher performing, make a higher profit, better teams. And what's true in business, I found it was true in government. My national security team, historically that's the most male area, is in national security defense. And in my last 2 years, the 3 most important national security advisors in my White House were all women. And so all the work we did with the Paris Accords and with the Iran nuclear deal and all our important initiatives, I had key women advising me. They were all very small also, by the way. They were all like, so I used to joke about how powerful they were in small packages. But part of what happens is that when women are involved in organizations, they bring a different perspective. And they have different insights. And one of the key things I've learned as a president is that you make your best decisions when you have different perspectives around the room. If everybody thinks the same way you do, then you're going to make bad decisions. Because we all have blind spots. We all have things we don't see. I know that many of you are involved in business and marketing, branding. If right now you are trying to market in the United States, at least, I know less about Colombia, but let's say in the United States. If you want to market to young people, and you have no people of color, you don't have any black or Latino people in the room, then you are going to be missing what is going to be half of your market over the next 20 years. If you are trying to sell clothes and you have no women in the room, but you're trying to sell clothes to women, Michelle, she teaches me this. She's like, it seems like they only make clothes for Malia and Sasha. My body is different than Malia and Sasha's. So they better talk to me if they want to know what I want to buy. And by the way, I control the pocketbook in the house. So I have the most disposable income, right? So I think that, whenever I was trying to make a very hard decision, the first thing I would do is have around the table not people who agreed with me, but also people who disagreed with me, or people who saw things from a different perspective. Because by having a dialogue with them and asking them questions and having them challenge the assumptions that I was making, I knew that at the end of the process, I would be making a better decision. It didn't mean that every decision I made was perfect, but it meant that I'd seen from every perspective how the decision I was making might lead to the results that we were hoping for.
Fantastic. In fact, diversity matters a lot. History was made when you became the first African American president of the United States of America, and that was the day we know story. Which advice would you give Colombia, where 25% of the population is Afro-Colombian, about thriving in a world where still racism and intolerance persist?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, when dealing with racial diversity, is to admit that there are racial issues in your country. Sometimes that's hard to do. You know, there's certain countries in Latin America, even when they have very, left-wing governments and they were revolutionaries, but then when they would come to the meetings with me in the White House, and I'd look around, and they didn't have a black face in the room. But they were revolutionaries. And if you try to suggest to them, you still have some issues here, they say, no. We no longer have any racial problems in our country. It's like, well, how come you all look like you do? Because I know that you've got 25, 30, 50% of your population does not look like you. So there is a denial. And I think the first thing is you have to acknowledge, and that happens obviously in the United States as well. You have to acknowledge the history, that it's not only that there are racial differences, but there are racial hierarchies, and that results from the past. In the United States, it's primarily black-white, but now that the Latino population is rising, suddenly now there's more aggression towards Latino immigration because people are nervous. Oh, are we going to be the same? How come people are speaking Spanish in the grocery store? Because so much of race basically has to do with status and power. People want to keep their status, they want to keep their power. And they get nervous when they think somehow that the privileges they've had are slipping away. So you have to acknowledge that there are issues there and problems. Now, once you've acknowledged it, then the question is, what are we teaching our children? Because that's when attitudes start. Children do not start off being racist. If you watch 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds playing, they can't tell the difference. We teach them to have an attitude. And it's not just what we teach them directly, it's what they see in television, it's what they see in school books, it's what they see in the movies, which is why culture is important. I know the Minister of Culture is here, and I think it's important to understand that in the United States, for example, I probably would not have been elected president if it hadn't been for Jackie Robinson, a sports figure. Suddenly you have little white boys rooting for a black guy who's playing baseball. Or they see a movie, Denzel Washington, they go, oh, Some of the young ladies, they think, oh, he's handsome. Okay, they start having different ideas, right? So culture is important. But what we teach our children is important. And that means, and government has a role in making sure that in its appointments, in its how it talks about these issues, that it is honest. The good news is that if you do it well, as I said earlier, it is a strength rather than a weakness. The greatest strength of the United States is that we have people from everywhere. So, there's if you have a diverse country, it means you can steal ideas from every place. It's the reason that the food is better in countries that have diversity. Because you take some spices from here and you get some, you go to New York, you got pizza, you got good Chinese food, you got good Italian food. You're not just eating the same thing over and over again. Well, it's the same with music, right? And young people understand this, which is why it doesn't matter where I go in the world now. I remember I was in Vietnam, because we would have these young leaders forums. And I would take questions from the audience. And one young woman stands up, she said, "I'm a Vietnamese rapper." Okay. Because hip hop is sampling from every place. And that, I think, is part of what we have to embrace, not reject. But we have to admit that discrimination still takes place, and that we have to be intentional. The same is true, as I said earlier, about sexism and how we treat women. If you walk into a business and all the decision makers are men and all the secretaries are women, that means you're not thinking about it, you're not focused on it. And part of what we try to do on all these issues in my administration is to ask ourselves, okay, if we can find a qualified woman for that position where there's never been a woman, can we do it? They still have to do good work, right? You have to have high standards, but if you give people opportunity, they'll rise to the occasion. So it is not something that happens overnight. Culture is something that happens over time, but it can change. And part of my election, and one last point I would make, I think you have to understand, because it takes time, people's ideas, they may change a little bit, but they may not change completely. I remember when I was running for office, sometimes my volunteers would go knock on doors to ask somebody, are you going to vote for Obama? And they'd say, yeah, I'm voting for but they wouldn't say black guy. They would use a word that is not so good. So they had made the mental leap to say, I'm going to support him, but they were still using the old word. And that's part of the process, right? So, I would tell my team, well, don't get too offended. Get his vote. Then later, they'll go back and they'll say, no, by the way, don't use that word. It's not such a great word. But that's part of the process that takes place. And I think sometimes those of us who are pushing change, we become we scold. Somebody says the wrong thing, they you're a racist or you're sexist. And part of what I tell my children is I say, look, all of us have these ideas in our heads. Nobody's pure. We all have our own biases and prejudices because we grew up in societies that have them. So, there's the old saying, don't if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones, right? So the same is true in this issue. I think we have to sometimes be patient with people and recognize that they're not always going to be saying the right thing exactly the right way every time. And for those of you who are in businesses, obviously, I would just say that if you are not aware of this right now, your businesses will be hurt because young people have better attitudes about this than old people do. And if you want the market that is coming, then you need to understand that those old attitudes, young people, they're not interested in the old prejudices, the old biases.
Thank you, Mr. President. Talking about young people, Martin Luther King Jr. said that if I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. The Obama Foundation mission is to inspire, empower, and connect people to change their world. How do you manage to deal with these challenges and make them happen?
When I was leaving the White House, Michelle and I, we sat down and talked, and we said, what are we going to do now that we left? And right away we agreed we should get more sleep, so that we slept for a while. But then we also said, how do we want to continue to help people and make a difference? And what we decided was that I care very much about specific issues like education or climate change or peace. But what I discovered as president was the single biggest problem that we face is not that we don't have good answers, but it's that we don't have enough leaders to move those answers forward in the world. And I had been inspired when I was president. Every country I went to, I would try to have meetings with young people, just to hear from them, to talk to them, to inspire them. And I said, why don't we have our foundation focus on training the next generation of leadership? So what the Obama Foundation really is designed to do is to identify young leaders in every country around the world, including in the United States, and to give them the resources and the training and the inspiration so that we can train hundreds of thousands and millions of young leaders across national boundaries, across issues, so that over time we are developing 1,000 Baracks and 1,000 Michelles, and at every level, not just at the very top of government or business, but also at the local levels and in villages and in communities. Because my background, I started working in poor communities in Chicago, and I'm a big believer that change oftentimes comes from the bottom up, not from the top down, and that you need leadership from everywhere. So we've now, we've only been operating now for a year and a half. We're building a presidential center in Chicago where we can do trainings in classrooms. There'll be a university for social change. We're partnering with universities and organizations around the world. We had a summit of the top 200 young leaders in Africa from 50 countries last year. We're doing something similar in Asia next year, and our hope is, or rather this year, our hope is that next year we'll do something about America.
It's amazing how time flies when you speak, Mr. President. It's amazing. Everything's so interesting and inspiring. From your perspective, what is the next wave of disruption and change that you see in the future? Is technology at the core of that change, or is human talent? How can Colombia and Latin America foster innovation and creativity in this environment?
Well, one of the things that I discovered when I was speaking with young leaders from across the continent, across Latin America, is how many entrepreneurs there are, how many young leaders there are who are setting up businesses and starting social media networks, and so there's a huge amount of energy and innovation. the countries that succeed are the ones that help those young people succeed. And I think there's some, each country is different, but there's some common ingredients. Number one is what I mentioned earlier. A country has to invest in its education system. And I do think that there's still an underinvestment in education in Colombia, across Latin America, and in the United States. We are not training our young people in the jobs of the future and the opportunities of the future. We're still looking backwards. The second thing is you have to have a government that is efficient and where there's rule of law, so that if you want to start a business, you don't have to pay a bribe. It happens quickly. There's just a basic efficiency. So you're creating a platform and environment for entrepreneurs and new ideas to succeed. And, in my own country, there are some who say government is the problem. The free market, everything is about the free market. But the truth is that the marketplace doesn't work if you don't have good government and good structures. If you don't have good roads and airports, you can't get your goods in and out. If you don't have good energy systems and you have blackouts, that's going to affect the bottom line of the business. If you don't have rule of law and you invent a great app and somebody can steal it because there's no rules governing intellectual property, then you give people no incentive to create new applications for their phone, right? So that is important. And I think that the idea that somehow you can ignore good government while still having the marketplace solve your problems and succeed and rising economic, that's not how things work. If you look at the countries that succeed, they have a basic, solid way of doing business. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the other thing that we have to understand is that technology is driving things so quickly. Just to give you an example, artificial intelligence, what's called AI, many of you have probably read about it. I've actually seen some of the capacity. Right now, your laptop, they have self-learning applications that can read x-rays better than radiologists. So there are not just unskilled people who are going to be put out of work by this AI, but highly skilled professions, suddenly machines are going to start doing. What that means is that the people who are successful are the people who can do things machines can't do. The creative thinking, the innovation, the using applications to create value. And what that also means is that countries and organizations are going to succeed if they are putting power in the hands of each person. You can't have somebody just sitting on an assembly line doing the same thing over and over again, because machines are going to be doing that. So if you're successful, you have to have every one of your employees empowered to think creatively, come up with new ideas, be able to work in a team setting, and that once again means that you have to think less from the top down and more as a circle, with everybody making contributions. And I think that when you go to Silicon Valley, it's interesting to see how those teams operate. They have very flat organizational structures. And the offices are open because they want people going from office to office, constantly trying to figure out, what are you working on? How are you doing this? Let's solve this problem together, as opposed to everybody just doing something on their own. But I will say this, if countries don't make this investment now, and they think that they can employ their young people in manual labor, then they're probably going to start seeing more and more unemployment.
And talking about young people, in Colombia, such as in the rest of Latin America, 40% of the population is young. One of my favorite quotes from you is, I am asking you to believe not in my ability to create change, but in yours. We've heard about government and about companies. What is your advice for the next generation of leaders in Colombia and Latin America?
One of the great things about being young is that you shouldn't be trapped by the old ideas of the past. You can see the world in new ways. You're not trapped by this idea that, well, that's how we always did things. And I want young people to trust those instincts in their own power and their own ability to reimagine their societies, reimagine businesses, reimagine how politics can work. Usually the advice I give young people is that if you want to be a leader, the most important thing is to recognize that very few people accomplish great things by themselves. And even the people we think of as geniuses. Picasso, he worked with Braque, and he worked with a whole bunch of different painters to develop his style. Great musicians, they learn from different collaborations. Great athletes, unless you are just Serena Williams look, you're from Argentina. Messi is amazing, but Argentina's had trouble winning the World Cup.
Don't remind me, please.
Even though you have the greatest player, because it's a team. And so what I always say to young people is that you have to think in terms of how do you learn to work with other people in ways that encourage them also to be powerful and also to succeed. As opposed to thinking, how do I step on somebody else to make myself bigger? How do I lift up people so that they're succeeding? Because if they succeed, then I'm going to succeed as well. The second advice I often give young people is focus more on what you want to do and not what you want to be. And what I mean by that is, when I was in Washington, I'd meet young people, they'd come and they'd say to me, oh, Mr. President, I want to be a president. And I'd say, why? Well, I don't know. But I think that that's true in politics, it's true in business. And what I say to young people is usually the people who are the most successful, it's because they're passionate about what they're doing. I didn't go into politics because I said I want to be president. I went to politics because I said I want children to have health care. And I want young people to be able to get a great education. And I was working on those things that led me into politics because it was a means for me to achieve those goals. Bill Gates didn't start off saying, I want to be the richest man in the world. He said, I really love computers. And he worked to try to create software that would revolutionize how we consume information. The byproduct was that he built this amazing company and became extraordinarily wealthy. So, thinking in terms of what is it that you want to accomplish? What are you most interested in and passionate about, and investing your time and passion and energy into that, I think is most important. And then the last thing I say to young people is you better work harder. Because, the truth is that, and I tell this to my daughters, so this is the same advice I give to my girls. I said, I don't care what you love, what you care about. If you don't invest time, you will not be excellent at it. And if you're not excellent, then it doesn't matter what your intentions are, you are not going to, people will not follow somebody who is not working hard and doing their best. In the White House, I always used to say, I will never get mad at you for making a mistake, but I will get mad if I feel as if you're not doing your best. And I think that is and you lead by example. The leaders who you end up most admiring are the people who themselves make sacrifices. I remember traveling to South Africa for this first time and going to Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years. And you would hear stories, including from some of his colleagues who are still alive. They would tell me about what it was like being a prisoner with Mandela. And Mandela, the guards sometimes would say, Mandela, here, you can have this special meal. They'd say, well, no, I'm not going to have this meal if all the other prisoners are not getting this meal. Oh, Mandela, you don't have to break rocks in the hot sun all day. No, that's what my colleagues are doing, that's what I have to do too. And so it's not a speech that made Nelson Mandela great. It's people seeing somebody living out their convictions and making sacrifices. And that's what people watch. What do you do? Not just what you say.
Fantastic, Mr. President. Fantastic. Thank you. You can just mention your daughters, Sasha and Malin. How would you describe the world you imagine for them?
Well, look, I am always optimistic, and I tell my daughters that as difficult as things seem today, and I think we watch the television, we read the newspapers, and we say, we have so many problems around the world. There's war, and there's conflict, and there's racism, and there's environmental catastrophe, and crime. I said, but the truth is, if you looked across history, and you had a choice, when do you want to be alive? And you could be alive at any moment in human history, and you didn't know ahead of time who were you going to be. You didn't know whether you would be a man or a woman, you didn't know whether you'd be rich or poor, what country you lived in. What moment would you choose? You would choose today. Because as bad as the news is sometimes, the world has never been wealthier, it has never been healthier, it has never been better educated, it's never been more tolerant of people's differences than it is today. And so that's a reminder that we should stay optimistic, because something Dr. King once said, he said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I believe, I have faith in the human capacity to solve problems and to use our minds and to rise above our petty conflicts. But it requires us using our minds. And sometimes we don't do that. So when I think about the world for my daughters, I want a world in which we take climate change seriously, because the planet's getting warmer, and that's going to affect people around the world. And there's no escaping that. And that is science, and it is fact. So I also want a world in which People believe in facts and science and not just opinions. One of the problems I see in the internet is people read anything and they say, oh, this must be true. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. You know, I often quoted a politician in the United States who once said, you are entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Some things are true and some things are not true. And sometimes politicians, they just say whatever comes into their heads. And that may work for a while, but eventually truth catches up. So you can deny that the planet is getting warmer, but eventually the sea is going to be 3 feet or 4 feet or 5 feet higher. And I don't want to leave that to my children. And finally, I want a world in which we have overcome our tendency as humans to look at people's differences rather than to see what we have in common. I mean, the fact that with everything that we know, we still judge people based on the color of their skin or their gender or their religion makes no sense. Because of what we know about the universe, we are this tiny little dot that is circling around one sun out of billions of suns. And the idea that my hair is curly and yours is not makes a difference, makes no sense. That can't be true. And so if we're organizing our society or our politics around those superficial differences, then we're making a mistake. And I hope for a world in which we recognize each other's common humanity. Because parents in Colombia want the same thing for their children as parents in the United States, as the same thing as parents in India. They want their children to be healthy. They want them to have opportunity. They want them to be able to work hard and make something of their lives. They want them to be safe. All of us have the same disappointments and hopes and dreams. You know, one of the things that one of my favorite moments of my presidency was very early in my presidency. I was in Mexico, and the great novelist, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is still alive, he came as a guest of the Mexican president. And he gave me 100 Years of Solitude. He gave it to me, his copy. He had it signed. He said, 100 Years of Friendship, Gabriel. And that was one of my favorite books when I was very young, when I was in college reading. I'd never been to Colombia. The life that was led in Colombia that he describes in his book is different than mine. I was living in Hawaii when I was reading it. And yet, because we are the same, deep down, I could read that and it could speak to my spirit. And that's evidence, that's proof that we're the same. And I hope that that's something that we understand for our kids.
Unfortunately for all of us, we are reaching the end of this unforgettable conversation. Time flies, I'm sorry. It's a fact, it's not my opinion. You have more than 6,000 people here and other hundreds of thousands seeing us or listening through social media from Colombia and Latin America and the world that would love to change the world, but they don't know how. These last minutes, we would appreciate the final message from you to guide them towards their goal, please, Mr. President.
Start now. If you want to change, start now. That's my main message. It's the message I give my daughters, it's the message I give my staff, it's the message I give myself. I mean, every day you wake up, there's something you can do better. There's someone you can treat kinder. There's some contribution you can make in your community. There's somebody who is disadvantaged that you could help. And so in that long journey towards having an impact, the first step is always the one that makes the biggest difference. And I think so often we tell ourselves we want to do something, but we always think that, okay, there will come a time when I'm going to do it. Start now. And if you start now, I promise, with all the talent and ideas that are in this auditorium, not only can you change Colombia, but you can change the world. Thank you very much.